So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Bill Lucy. I'm the Long Island Soundkeeper, and I work for Save the Sound. We're a regional group, and we work on a whole variety of different environmental actions, from land preservation to climate policy, fisheries, wetland restoration. And what we're here to talk about tonight is water quality. And what we're specifically talking about is not only the water quality of Black Rock Harbor, but also what's going to happen with the wastewater treatment facility. And the genesis of this meeting was 5 years ago, I was calculating. I believe that's right, Lauren, when the attorneys from Save the Sound and myself met with Lauren at her office when she had newly taken the helm of both the treatment plants in Bridgeport. And she had a big issue on her hands. There was a lot of work to do. And one of the ways we accomplish that work is through what's called a long-term control plan. So the initial idea of this meeting was to go over the advancement on the long-term control plan, which I'll explain in a minute. And then we ended up adding a water quality component to it, which Peter Linderoth is going to talk about. We have a big citizen program in over 40 bays and harbors called the Unified Water Study, and they go hand in hand. But getting back to the long-term control plan, that comes as approved by the state, and it lays out a path and a schedule to bring all the wastewater treatment plants in the state up to snuff. And what we're really talking about is a CSO-free Connecticut. That's the ultimate goal right now. And back in the day, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe there was 18 towns or so that had these combined sewer overflows, which are an old style of getting rid of waste, where rainwater and wastewater would mix and overflow into our rivers and into our ocean, into the Sound. Now, today, we're down to 6 towns, but they're big ones and they're very expensive to fix. So what we do is we track this calendar of events. And it's been a real pleasure working with Lauren, because she has been very diligent and working towards the goals and the timeline of the long-term control plan. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren to give a little update about where we are and where we're going. So take it away, Lauren.
Okay, thank you, Bill. And Bill, it's actually only been 3 years, not 5. I wish it was 5 because we'd be further along, but it's only been 3 since.
Really? Okay. I thought it was 2018, 2017.
No,
Yeah,
I started
anyway.
in 2019. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, time flies.
No, so we're making progress. You had sent me some issues to be touched on. That's how I'll start this. Is it okay if I just go down that list?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right. So I also have with me my team from CDM Smith, who, when I'm done, are going to give a presentation. Our facilities plan was submitted to DEEP, that's our regulatory agency, in November of 2020. And in December, we did get approval to go ahead with design. Dan and Joe have prepared a presentation to show you what that's gonna look like. We have a good idea. Walk you through the facility plan. But first, I'm gonna bring you up to speed with where we are in terms of our consent orders and how things have been modified. To start with, okay, the Pequannock water quality monitoring. So that gets updated every 5 years. So we're still in the middle of it. We, between April and September, we go out 9 times and sample, 6 in dry weather, 3 in wet weather, and submit it annually to DEEP. And as far as I know, DEEP is satisfied with this program. I don't expect any changes. That we'll just continue doing that. As far as the Ash Creek storage tank project, so a long time ago, in the original long-term control plan, one of the items that they had listed to eliminate some of the CSO was to build an underground storage tank. In other words, that would hold some of the combined rainwater and wastewater back from the plant to allow the plant so that we wouldn't have overflows, but also the plant could handle it capacity wise. So we went out with an RFQ, RFP and solicited a Kleinfelder team, and actually then approached Deep because to me, the tank didn't seem like the most effective way to eliminate CSOs. So it was our request to Deep if we could take 2 steps back and reassess what might be a better approach. And what was determined through a study was that conveyance to the plant with its proposed increased capacity could handle a lot more of the CSOs, that is remove overflow, than putting in a 2 million gallon tank, which is nothing for a 90 million gallon plant. So that's where we're headed. So we had some original dates in our long-term control plan regarding that tank, but since we've sort of switched gears and have eliminated the construction of this tank and gone down the road of increasing conveyance to the west side plant, the dates have slightly changed. And that was formalized in June by Deep with just modifications to our long-term control plan. In terms of the west side plant upgrade, I guess the question, what is the status of the plant upgrade and upcoming deadlines? So where we're at, like I said, we submitted our facilities plan in November of 2020, and in December of 2021, we received written approval from Deep that we could move forward with design. Well, we can't do that without Clean Water Fund money. So we have submitted our application for that money. And the minute we get that money, we will proceed immediately with design. In terms of a timeline, it's estimated that design will take 18 months. Then the final design will be submitted to Deep again for approval to move forward to put that out to bid. So at this point, I would say it's modified. So it took 13 months to get approval of the facilities plan. So at this point, we've tacked on 13 months, like pushing out the schedule a little bit. But I think it's been pretty remarkable how quickly we've moved on some things. So I'm hoping either we make up time or just stick to that schedule. And I believe, and Ann, correct me if I'm wrong, that Deep is satisfied with that schedule. So moving on to the West Plant upgrade impact to the long-term control plan. Because of increased capacity, and now with the thought of increasing conveyance to the plant with the increased capacity, that right there is going to eliminate 50% of the CSOs on the west side. That, of course, then is going to be reflected in the CSO long-term control plan because, well, that's already been modified. It looks like the tanks aren't necessary, that we can handle it at the plant. Our next phase, and this is the next point on this request, the sieve storage tank. Well, that's proposed in Ellsworth Park. And it's our intent to study it the same way we did with the Ash Creek tank to see if that's the most viable option for eliminating CSOs. It hasn't been done yet. It's scheduled to be done, I believe, in 2 years. But my sense is we're going to find the same response, the same remedy, or not the same, but the tank is probably not going to be required under the Ellsworth Park, which I think we're all pretty happy about because I don't think that would ever get built. And then the final, we have ongoing maintenance. So the third-party operator, which is currently Inframark, is required, and this was determined by EPA, to clean 8,500 catch basins a year, clean 30 miles of pipe a year, and TV and clean, if necessary, another 30 miles of pipe. The third-party operator has always met these goals. In 2021, this past current year, we did not make 8,500, we made 8,300, but that was a staffing issue, which we've been pretty fortunate. The pandemic and staffing issues has not hit us as hard as other places, but there were some lean months. So we made 8,300 catch basins, although we did make the TVing and cleaning requirements. And we are on track to meet our 2026 deadline of TVing 100% of the system. To be honest, we TV way more than the 30 miles because every time there's an issue, we take the TV truck out there. So I'm not concerned about making that. I think that in terms of bringing up the speed with the agreement order and the long-term control plan, both the plants and the plant upgrade and the CSOs, that's all I have. I don't know if you want questions later or you want them now, but if we could move on, I'd like to have Dan and Joe proceed with their presentation on the.
Yes, yeah, we're on a tight
Okay.
schedule, so we'll keep going with
Yeah.
the presentations and take questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right,
Or
Joe
go
and Dan
ahead and
from
put them in the
CDM Smith.
chat as well. If you want to put questions in the chat, we'll try and answer them as we go that way.
Okay. Hey, everyone, I'm Dan Murphy. I'm here with Joe LaLiberty. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I have privileges to do that. Okay, so thanks, Lauren. That was a good overview of where we're at. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into the facility plan itself, which really focused on the wastewater treatment plants, but it did dovetail in with the CSOs and the long-term control plan, which you'll see in sort of the second half of this presentation. We spent the bulk of 2020 working on this, and as Lauren mentioned, it was submitted to DEEP in November of 2020 and recently approved. So some of the goals of the facility plan as we got into it were first and foremost to move the plants into the 21st century. We want to use the latest technologies to help serve Bridgeport for the long haul moving forward here. Many of the facilities and technologies, were a little outdated and getting old. So certainly upgrading them to the latest, addressing the nitrogen discharges from both plants, but particularly the West, which has struggled to meet the general permit for nitrogen discharges in recent years. To address DEEP's resiliency requirements. These requirements call for facilities to be protected to the 100-year flood elevation plus 3 feet. This is to factor in sea level rise and some of the coastal increase in coastal storms we've seen in recent years. So we certainly built that into the recommended upgrades of the plants. Addressing the combined sewer overflows throughout the collection system. And this would be achieved by increasing the capacity at both the east and west plants, and we'll show you the benefits that will have out in the collection system itself. And then looking to incorporate sustainable features throughout the plants, green infrastructure. We're taking a look at a wind turbine at the west plant, solar where we can, water reuse and energy efficiency throughout. So starting over at the east plant, this might look familiar to some of you, off of Seaview Ave. The flow comes in off from the main interceptor off the road, goes through the treatment process, and basically gets discharged to the man-made powerhouse channel that goes right out into Bridgeport Harbor. This facility has it dates back quite some years. There's been several upgrades over the years, but pretty much all the equipment is overdue for upgrades. The proposed upgrades would make use of the site. There's not a lot of existing land on site, but first and foremost, upgrading the headworks facility to give it fine screening capability, giving it grit removal capability, two processes of which the existing plant's a little bit lacking right now. Following that would be cloth filters for primary filtration, and these would act in both dry weather and wet weather scenarios, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. Enhancing the nitrogen removal capability with the process called IFAS, or integrated fixed film activated sludge. So this will help reduce nitrogen for years to come at future plant flow and loading capacities. And then the final steps would be UV disinfection and an effluent pump station. The UV disinfection would take the place of the chlorine disinfection that's currently used, and then the effluent pump station would ensure that we could get flow out against those flood elevations, the 100-year flood +3 that I mentioned earlier. That's the overview of the east. Actually, yeah, let me talk about the outfall for a bit here. So we did look at the existing outfall. As I mentioned, it discharges to Powerhouse Channel. It's a 60-inch diameter pipe. It was constructed in the 1950s, and we did TV inspect the pipe. It is in decent condition. The size is adequate for the flows that we're talking about here. So we are considering doing some trenchless technology lining for it, just to give it new life for the future. But the benefit of extending the outfall really isn't there's really a marginal benefit. Basically, the water discharges to a man-made channel out to Bridgeport Harbor. So there's no recommendation at this point to extend that outfall. Jumping over to the west plant. Again, this is probably familiar to some. The aquaculture school is on the same parcel as is Captain's Cove, which just is cut off in this picture. But flow comes in off the interceptor on Bostwick Street. Again, passes through the existing treatment processes. The existing outfall heads right out, basically under the docks of Captain's Cove, out to Cedar Creek. So the proposed upgrade here with the expanded capacity to 200 MGD would be very, very similar process train that we're proposing at the east, the new Headworks facility with screening and grit removal, the dual use primary filtration for dry weather and wet weather treatment, IFAS for nitrogen removal, UV disinfection, and an effluent pump station as well. So similar treatment train, just a much larger capacity treatment plant here. In terms of the outfall, there's a 72-inch diameter pipe that discharges just in the vicinity of Captain's Cove here. The size of the pipe, again, is adequate for the flows that we're talking about here. The size and condition, I already said that the condition is adequate, and we're proposing to line that pipe to extend its life expectancy. Extending that pipe would be a major undertaking due to the location and some of the challenges that would need to be overcome extending it. So we did consider it. We looked at a couple locations for deep water discharges. So on the left side graphic here, hopefully you can see my pointer. We considered two outfalls out to deep, two routes out to deep water, 2-mile extension. There are shellfish claims out in that area, so there would be an impact to those shellfish claims if we were to discharge in the vicinity of those claims. It would be an extensive permitting process, and it really becomes a project in and of itself. On the order of magnitude of 200 million was the estimate that we came up with. So at this point, we're not recommending that. We're recommending to put the funds into upgrading the treatment plant to discharge higher quality water from the existing plant. And this is certainly something that could be considered in the future. With the expanded capacity here at the west, there's some additional land that will be needed. The red parcel up top here, this sort of L-shaped parcel, is owned by the city. So there's a lease arrangement that needs to be worked out between the city and WPCA for that land. And there's also been some discussions with Captain's Cove of modifying their lease to take the green land here and potentially have a second means of access into the site behind the aquaculture school. So shifting over to the collection system for a bit here, it's basically, it serves the entire city of Bridgeport. Trumbull is tributary to the West Side treatment plant. There's 26 CSO regulators in the collection system, with 20 on the west side and 6 on the east side. These stars you can see throughout the graphic represent CSO discharge locations in the various water bodies around the city. There's 113 miles of gravity sewer, of combined sewer, which are the blue, and they're more in the older downtown areas, and then 170 miles of separated sewer, which is out more in the outskirts of the city. So the plan that we're proposing here really kills two birds with one stone. It upgrades the treatment plants, and by expanding the capacity at the plants, it addresses CSO issues sooner than the original long-term control plan would. So the red line in this graphic represents the original long-term control plan. And as Lauren mentioned earlier, there's 2 tank projects proposed, the Ash Creek and the Ellsworth project. So the impacts of those projects are represented by these little dips in CSO volume discharge during the 1-year storm. So basically you do these projects, you get a little bit of benefit, and then the bulk of that long-term control plan called for a deep tunnel under the city to capture the CSO and then get bled back into the treatment facilities when the rainstorm subsided. That was not scheduled to be complete until 2039. So that at that point, when the tunnel was complete, there'd be a dramatic drop in CSO, but that's year 2039. The green line represents the current project that was outlined in the facility plan. And there's a little dip for an Ash Creek conveyance project here in the near term. And then when the West plant gets upgraded with an increased peak flow or wet weather peak flow capacity of 200 MGD, we see a significant drop in the CSO volume discharged in the west side tributary area. And then likewise, when the East plant is completed and expanded to an 80 MGD peak wet weather capacity, there's another significant dip in the CSO volume. So basically, the plants need to be upgraded. The collection system can convey significantly more than currently is treated at the plants. So this plan takes advantage of that capacity in the system, upgrades the plants, and knocks the CSO volume down significantly. And as you can see, in a much shorter duration than would have under the other long-term control plan. So we used a SWIM model to kind of prove this out. And we did a lot of analysis and how we arrived at this conclusion. So on the west side, the existing capacity, secondary treatment capacity is 58 MGD. And that is proposed to remain, so that the plant would have a 58 MGD capacity under all scenarios. But what we modeled was a peak capacity of about 80 MGD. That's the current peak capacity due to just the wear and tear on the pumps and some of the systems. It was originally designed for 90 MGD. And then we explored a whole bunch of flow scenarios between 90 and 200, but settled on the 200 MGD for the peak capacity at the west. And then over at the east, secondary capacity is 24 MGD. That's proposed to remain. But the scenarios we looked at over there were the current peak capacity of about 35 MGD, again, due to wear and tear on the equipment, the design capacity of 40, and then an expanded capacity of 80. So when you run these simulations through the model, what we have on this graphic is showing under the existing scenario, total volume discharge in a year is represented by these bars. So you can see that the day in and day out flow is by far the biggest contributor to the water bodies. That's the green part of this bar. And then the CSO volume is kind of the red slivers at the top. So west side existing scenario, west side, if the original design capacity of 90 MGD could be maintained, that sliver would go down slightly, and more flow could be put through the treatment plant. And then with the expanded capacity, again, that sliver gets even a little bit smaller, so less CSO being discharged through the system, but the net total water discharged to Cedar Creek and Black Rock Harbor, relatively the same, but that reducing that sliver has a huge impact on the aesthetics and the pollutants in the water body. Similar story over at the east. Again, the CSOs, very small, relatively small volume, but it can have a huge impact, on the water quality. So some of the, the main constituents that CSOs contribute are fecal coliform. So fecal coliform is a very, strong indicator of waste in the water. TSS and just total nitrogen are discharged, with the CSO flows. So using the model data, we simulated 2017 to 2019. This is data we had, to calibrate our model. And so what you're seeing here is the maximum daily flow through that period. The blue at the bottom represents is capped off at the current 80 MGD capacity of the west plant. So these flows arriving at the west side over 80 MGD are discharged as CSOs. They can't be taken through the plant. But when we expand it to 200 MGD, they will be taken through the plant. So they will receive treatment, primary treatment, disinfection, and be discharged. So during that 2017 to 2019 time period, there's 142 days where flow was over the 80 MGD capacity. So those were the days when the CSOs would have been active. On the east side, similar story. There was 87 days where the flow would have been over the 35 MGD capacity of the plant, and by expanding the treatment capacity to 80 MGD, we'll be able to capture and treat those rainfall events as well. So this slide really summarizes the net impact of what we're proposing here. So the increasing the treatment plant capacity will reduce frequency and magnitude of CSOs. It'll improve the capture, of floatables and solids during high flow events. It'll reduce the annual pollutant loadings to the receiving waters. And based on our modeling, the treated effluent will only increase by 1.3%. So a very slight increase in the effluent discharge from the plants, but the CSO volume that would be discharged throughout the collection system in that 1 year event will be decreased by 51%. Fecal coliform decreased by 60%, TSS by 62%, and total nitrogen by 34%. So a huge impact on the water quality throughout the greater Bridgeport area. In terms of the schedule, Lauren hit on this a bit. So the goal is to have the west side plant designed by the end of 2023. There's a pretty long construction duration, just due to the phasing and the nature of this type of construction. So we'll be looking at having that online in 2028. And at some point during that construction, starting in on the design of the east side. The exact timing of that needs to be worked out, but having the design of the east side going concurrent, and then the east side construction would slightly overlap with the west and being online in 2030. So the next steps, this is the last slide here, and then we'll open up to some questions. The local funding approval for the projects were completed in April of 2021. The facility plan, as mentioned earlier, was approved in December of 2021. The EIE process was completed around that same time. The city has some 8 million in ARPA funds available that would need to be transferred from the city to the WPCA to make that available for the project. WPCA also applied for 10 million additional ARPA funds, so that's still pending. Lauren mentioned this earlier, that the Clean Water Fund application for the project was recently submitted. So we're hopeful that DEEP will be able to come through with some clean water funds for this project. And the goal would be to start the design this spring to get this project underway. So that is the end of the presentation. I guess we can open it up for questions.
We're gonna save the questions to the end. That was a great
Okay.
synopsis. There was some new stuff in there. And again, if you have any questions for Dan or Lauren, just put them in the chat in case we run out of time. But I know, Peter, you have about 16 slides, so I'm gonna hand it off to Peter just to make sure we get everything packed in here. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bill, and thanks, Dan. I'm going to jump right in. Some of you know me. I saw a lot of familiar names. Some of you don't. I'm Peter Linderoth, Director of Water Quality at Save the Sound, and here to give a Black Rock Harbor water quality update. You might see WQ pop up now and then. I did my best to limit acronyms, but that does stand for water quality, if you are wondering. And I'm here to talk about Black Rock Harbor today. So one, I wanted to talk Unified Water Study. It's been a couple years since I've been here, but we had our Unified Water Study group talk last year at this excuse me, at this event. So brief, just what the UWS is, Unified Water Study is, then diving in a bit on Black Rock Harbor water quality based on data that the Unified Water Study collects and some next steps. And then happy, if I have time, I'm going to hope to stick around till 7. So I'm going to keep breezing through fairly quickly. Some of you have heard about the Unified Water Study, man. I think I talked about it for like 30 minutes a couple years ago, just what it is and what we do. So I only have a couple slides on that, but happy to answer questions if some of you are new to this. The Unified Water Study is a water quality monitoring program for community science groups, developed specifically for community science groups, which is all encompassing. We have, nonprofits, we have municipalities, 100% volunteer groups. But the point of it is, there's lots of really great water quality data that exists in the open sound, over 3 decades worth, that's being collected by our regulatory groups like DEEP, New York City Department of Environmental Protection, and the Interstate Environmental Commission, other groups too. And there's also some great data in the bays and harbors and inlets around the sound, but it was a little bit more sparse. There's over 100 of those, and it was collected by different groups in different ways. So what this study and monitoring program really does is fills the margins of the sound with environmental health data. And by doing that, we selected these parameters to do that, I should say. So what you're looking at now are water quality parameters that this program monitors. Black Rock Harbor, of course, being one of the embayments or inlets that's in the program. Tier 1, I'm going to get into what each of these are actually in detail, so I won't do it right now. But all the groups in the study collect Tier 1, and there's a subset of the groups that collect these Tier 2 data that are also really important. I think most important for this particular image, though, it's a 6-month water quality monitoring program that runs from May to October every year, and it's conducted in compliance with an EPA-approved quality assurance project plan. Really important for data comparability from bay to bay, harbor to harbor, for the whole program. And a big thank you to the Long Island Sound Study. This program, that's our geographic EPA program for the Long Island Sound, by the way. It's fully funded by the EPA at this point after some building process to get it to where it is. So thank you, EPA, Long Island Sound Study. I saw Mark Tedesco and I think a couple others from the Sound Study on this webinar. Here is a map where we're looking at all the embayments. I'll keep calling them embayments, but you can think of them as the bays, harbors, creeks, and rivers that the UWS, the Unified Water Study, is currently in. As you can see, in 2021, we're 24 groups strong at this point in 41 embayments. 2022, we're looking to add 2 new groups, so we'll be up to 26 groups in 44 embayments. So we're adding 3 new embayments, one of which is right in your backyard. I'm going to talk about that at the end. And then 2023, our proposal's already in for the 2023 season. We're looking at adding an additional group and an additional embayment. So as I continue to give this talk, this map just gets more and more cluttered. At some point, I'm going to have to figure out a better way to label all the bays and harbors that are in the program. And I want to thank the data providers. really, the Unified Water Study, really, it wouldn't exist if we didn't have those 24 groups collecting data in these bays and harbors. So thank you to the data providers. Here's a few of them smiling. We like it when they're all having a good time. And a special thank you to the BLR crew. So in this case, BLR, by the way, is our kind of unique identifier for Black Rock Harbor. And so big thank you to the Unified Water Study Black Rock Harbor group. A few of them are listed here I want to call out. We've got Kevin Blagas, who's been in this since the beginning or inception at Black Rock Harbor, giving his thumbs up. Thank you, Kevin. I see you out on this webinar as well. Rick Landau, I hope you got your last name right, Rick. Rick Landau from the Ash Creek Conservation Association joined the study a couple years ago. He's in the bottom left here, calibrating one of our sondes. And then we have Holly Turner Moore from Bridgeport Regional Aquaculture Science Technology Environmental Center. I hope I got that right. So that's also just BrazTech. I guess I could have cheated and just looked at this picture here. But thank you, Holly Turner Moore, for your work as well, and for getting the students really fired up about this. Everyone's come together around this harbor and really does a phenomenal job with the data collection that's happening at Black Rock. And so here are the locations that are monitored. Every single embayment in the study goes through a station selection process that's the same in respect to, we have a grid, we lay it over the bay and harbor. This happens to be Black Rock Harbor here. And then we generate random stations in each one of these hexagons. Sometimes we have to group a couple of them together. And then we go through the stations and really do our absolute best to pick the stations to be representative of the whole embayment. So there's no biases here, right? We didn't just plop a station right in front of the CSOs that Dan was talking about the combined sewer outfalls, or right in front of an MS4 stormwater outfall, or, you know, we do our absolute best to randomly select the stations and then keep them away from known bias. So we have a really good representative picture of the environmental health of a harbor that's in the study. So in respect to talking about the results, I need to talk about the Long Island Sound report card results, certainly, but then I'm also going to get into some water quality figures that were developed specifically with data provided by the Black Rock Harbor team. So hopefully many of you, I know many of you have, but hopefully all of you have heard of the Long Island Sound report card. It's something that saved the sound issues biennially, once every 2 years, I should say. And we're looking at 2016, 2018, and 2020 here. And yeah, we're due for another one. Our next report card's coming out autumn 2022. So I'm tongue-tied today, biennial release. And it's a great document. It's really informative. We took a lot of information and put it into a 4-pager. I'm not going to go into each section here, but I really encourage you just to look up Long Island Sound report card. If you haven't read this iteration, check out the 2020 report card. It talks more about the Unified Water Study, ways that people can take action to protect water in their local inlets. Always has a great picture of a lighthouse on the cover, executive summary. And then on the inside is a poster format for all the grades that are developed for the Long Island Sound report card. And so we developed grades for the open sound. I'm not going to talk in detail about those today, but as you can see, it's divided up into 5 basins, from the Eastern Basin all the way down to the Western Narrows, which is pretty much all New York City and some Westchester and Nassau waters. And those are open water data that fuel those grades collected by our regulatory groups that I mentioned before. And then in 2020, this was the first year that we included grades for some of the bays and harbors, specifically bays that are in the Unified Water Study, using data collected by those groups that I mentioned before. So each one of these circles represents a section of a bay, if it's split into 3 sections, like Norwalk Harbor here, or just a bay proper. So I'm going to zoom in on this momentarily, but here's Black Rock. You can see it's receiving a D. When you do take a look at this, and please, again, take a look on your own time, you can see we've listed all the groups that participate in the program over with the bay grades, and we break down each one of the parameters, receives a grade. I'm going to talk about what those parameters are again momentarily, and then each bay gets an actual grade. So Black Rock Harbor is receiving a D, which means there's lots of room for improvement, obviously. And while I encourage you definitely to look at this, I've probably said it 3 times already, I'd also encourage you to go to the Sound Health Explorer. That's the digital online home of the report card and some of the other initiatives that save the sound issues. So these colors should look familiar. But if you go to the Sound Health Explorer, you could go in and really start clicking on each one of the basins, each one's of the bays and harbors, to get more details on the grades. and more details on the parameters, what they mean, et cetera. So I did that here for Black Rock Harbor. So we're looking at data fueled the 2020 report card from 2019. So it received a D overall. And what these indicators are, this kind of red thing with a dead fish in it, unfortunately, is hypoxia. That means really, really low dissolved oxygen, but the grade itself is just based on dissolved oxygen. So Black Rock Harbor is really struggling on the oxygen concentration in the water. And it has been for years. I don't think that's a big surprise, but one of the great things about the report card is it can kind of package these data up so that people can take a kind of quick view and see what the issues are rather quickly, or they could dive in. This here is, hopefully you can see my mouse, but the orange section with the little dots in it, that's representing chlorophyll. That's another one that's also receiving a poor grade with a D. This is macrophytes or seaweeds also getting a D. A lot of chlorophyll in the water, a lot of seaweed in the water represents a lot of nitrogen entering the system. And in this case, mostly from the wastewater treatment plant. And then up here in the top right, we have water clarity, which actually Black Rock Harbor gets a pretty good grade for water clarity. And then this is oxygen saturation, this light green section. We could get more into that later, but with this D, you can see the challenges. Sewer discharges, as Dan was just talking about, the outfall for the West Side treatment plant is deep inside of Black Rock Harbor. So the nitrogen that comes from that sewer discharge is absolutely a challenge for Black Rock Harbor. Stormwater runoff is also a challenge given the impervious surface or the hardened surfaces around Black Rock Harbor. So those are roads, parking lots, roofs, structures, and such. Anything that's impervious that the rain hits and then kind of quickly flushes off and makes its way to the harbor. And climate change is a challenge that's facing, frankly, all of Long Island Sound, the world, really. So in this case, we also need to keep climate change in mind. As temperatures increase, we're going to have more and more challenges in our waterways. So again, go to the Sound Health Explorer. I didn't talk about this in 2019 because it wasn't fully issued yet, but go and take a look at the grade for Black Rock Harbor. Take a look at the grade for any of the other inlets and bays that are in Sound Health Explorer, and you can really dig in and see a lot of the information. And sorry, I'm buzzing along, but I really do have to go at 7 and I want to take some comments. So now I'm going to go into the water quality specific figures that we created with Unified Water Study collected by this Black Rock Harbor group. I said I was going to go into the parameters a bit more. So one of the things that we measure in the UWS is dissolved oxygen. Lots of groups measure dissolved oxygen in terms of ecological health. Oxygen is incredibly important to almost all animals in Long Island Sound. They need it to breathe, right? Just like we breathe oxygen with our lungs, fish, clams, other animals in the Sound, they have gills typically, and they need oxygen in the water to survive. So it makes its way into the water through a few different sources of diffusion, but think wave action, precipitation, and photosynthesis, right? So algae and such, and seaweed and algae and plants in the water release oxygen. And we record it in milligrams per liter. Generally speaking, in Long Island Sound, low or non-existent, when it does happen, is 0 milligrams per liter. That's called anoxia, means no oxygen in the water. And then high, really about as high as we'll ever see, it is 14 milligrams per liter, and 120% is referencing a saturation point. So pulling together all the data that the Black Rock Harbor crew has collected from 2019 to 2021, and the 2021 data is preliminary, but we gave it a really good look, and we feel really confident in the quality. Like I said, the group does a great job with their data collection, but the 2021 data probably won't be released until the spring. I put it together in a box plot here. So hopefully you all remember your box plots. I'm not going to go into this in terrible detail, but you can ask questions later. But the blue box represents about 50% of the data. And then the tails in the upper part of the tail here, this is the maximum data point, and this would be the minimum. And each one of these is about 25% of the data collected. On this particular figure, dissolved oxygen's on our y-axis. I outlined a couple things. 3 milligrams per liter is, and below, is termed as hypoxic by the EPA Long Island Sound study. It's where we start seeing death of fish and other animals in the water, but it can certainly happen a little above it too. So 3 to 5 is sort of a general range where it's okay for marine life, but we really want to get past that 5 milligrams per liter to be fully supportive of marine life. But I wanted to put that in as a point of reference for these box plots. On the x-axis here, we have the stations that I showed earlier on that figure or map. So BLR, Black Rock Harbor 01, BLR 02, those are those stations that run from the inner portion of the harbor at 01 to the outermost portion that we monitor at 06. And you can see all, based on this figure, all of these stations have dipped into hypoxia, except for BLR 06, which has come close. And that's an issue, but when you also look at it, a lot of the blue portions of the inner stations and all of the lower portions are almost in every single season going into hypoxic conditions, which is definitely a challenge, something we want to address. This N equals 198 is all the observations that made this figure. There's about 33 observations or samples that make up each one of these per station. Another way to look at this, so hopefully I didn't butcher you with my statistics explanation. If there's any statisticians out there, you probably are ready to string me up. And if you haven't looked at these in a while, I hope it was just enough to help understand them. But another way to look at this is to just take a snapshot of maybe the worst day that occurred for each year. So what we're looking at here is called an interpolation. It basically takes data collected, in this case from August 23rd, 2019, for each one of the stations, and then creates values throughout the rest of the harbor based on those data. I used Power 2 interpolation for anyone out there that uses GIS frequently. And you can see here, this is the dissolved oxygen concentration from low to high. So the lowest we had this day was 0.35, which is essentially anoxic, means like no oxygen in the water. That occurred up in this upper portion of Black Rock Harbor. And the highest we had was 3.96, which honestly is nothing for Black Rock Harbor to write home or to the sound about. It's also not a very high dissolved oxygen grade. And I went ahead and did this for 2019, which this is the same figure we looked at in 2019. 2020, so the worst, and this is just a one-day snapshot. There were other days that had hypoxia, but the worst day in 2020 was August 21st, 2020, where you can see, again, we had anoxia in the northeast kind of portion of Black Rock Harbor. And it basically made its way to about BLR 03, where the transition hit that day from hypoxic conditions, again, really detrimental to marine life, to a little bit higher. And the highest at BLR 06 that day was 6 milligrams per liter. And then for 2021, based on preliminary data, we did August 6th, which was the worst day for that season that just wrapped up not too long ago. And you can see it wasn't a great day in terms of hypoxia. We had anoxia almost all the way to Captain's Cove here to BLR 02, hypoxia all the way to BLR 04 on this day. And then it did clear up in this outer section of the harbor, which is a little bit, it's better flushed, of course. So these are snapshots. I'm happy to provide this PowerPoint to be sent out. We're happy to send it out so you can take a closer look at it. Yeah, and I'll give us some time to have some questions about this too, but just to breeze through it one more time, anything below 3 is a problem. Looking here, note a different scale and colors here up to 6, but again, hypoxia all the way to about here. And then here recently on August 6, 2021, we had a hypoxic event that was all the way out to BLR 04. All right, and surface turbidity, I did the box plot on this one too. It actually does pretty well in Black Rock Harbor. There are days where some of the stations do have more turbid water, but across the board, water clarity hasn't been a major concern. It's certainly not one of the best harbors around the Sound, but I did want to plot it out here, surface turbidity, which means water clarity. A quick explanation of turbidity too, because I know it can be a little, I'm kind of throwing a lot of different parameters out there. It's basically, like I said, cloudy, murky water. So in Long Island Sound, we really shouldn't have clear water. In the winter, the water is pretty clear, and that's okay. That's a good thing. But in the summer, if we had crystal clear water, we'd have a pretty big problem. It really shouldn't happen. Long Island Sound's an estuary. It's a mixing point for fresh water and salt water from the Atlantic Ocean. It's really productive. Lots of animals live in it. So we really shouldn't have crystal clear water like, say, the tropics. We'd be looking at a probably dead sound if that happened in the middle of the summer. But we want it to be balanced. Next up is chlorophyll. So I mentioned chlorophyll. It's a green pigment. I'm not going to read this to you, but basically it's found in the chloroplasts of plants and algae, and it's what makes photosynthesis possible. We use chlorophyll as a measure of how much phytoplankton's in the water. Phytoplankton being, for all intents and purposes, microscopic plants floating around in algae, floating around in the water. Some chlorophyll is very necessary for Long Island Sound and its bays and harbors. It's when we have a lot of chlorophyll that we know there's too much nitrogen, potentially excess nitrogen, I should say, entering the system. It's closely related to dissolved oxygen. Oftentimes, if we see abundant chlorophyll and big algal blooms and big mats of seaweed, we'll also see lower dissolved oxygen values in that system. It's generally speaking, it's a eutrophic system where lots of nutrients, nitrogen in this case, are entering in excess. Some nitrogen, good thing. Excess, not a good thing. And here we're looking at chlorophyll A. So May to October, again, 3 years. In this case, we do have some outliers that exist, and these were likely blooms at those stations, but up to about 20 micrograms per liter, the literature and reference documents say is okay for these coastal systems, estuarine systems. But as you get above 20 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll A, it starts to be an issue. And as you can see, we're having an issue with chlorophyll A and Black Rock Harbor, especially in the inner portion. We're looking at really abundant chlorophyll A, lots of blooms, likely fueled by excess nitrogen. And so I wanted to drop this in as a tool, one of many that's out there in terms of nitrogen and nitrogen entering our bays and harbors around the Sound. This particular pie chart is snipped out of a study by Vaudry et al. Vaudry, Charlie Yarish, Pickrell, some really well-known researchers around the Sound, developed a nitrogen loading model for all the bays and harbors across the Sound, over 100 of them. I'm focusing on Black Rock Harbor here. And what you can see, black, maybe a fitting color, the black here is representing the sewer input of nitrogen to the system. So you can see about 95% of the nitrogen, depending on which land use map you use, but about 95% of the nitrogen entering Black Rock Harbor is from the wastewater treatment plant. So that's a need to reduce. And it's good to see Dan talking about reductions that are going to be taking place, Lauren as well. But just keep in mind that really is the mother load of nitrogen entering the system. Black Rock Harbor is somewhat unique in that, there likely was a tributary that fed it at some point, but now with the land cover and the buildup that's happened around it, there's really not an identifiable tributary that comes in with fresh water. So it fills up, water can get trapped in there at times in the upper portion, and it's really susceptible to the impacts of excess nitrogen, and 95% of it coming from the wastewater treatment plant. So next steps, one of those new embayments that's being added to the Unified Water Study is going to be Bridgeport Harbor. So thank you to Ash Creek Conservation Association, the names I was telling you about earlier too, Holly, Rick, and Kevin. This is really fantastic. It was also brought on, so as I mentioned, the EPA covers the entire study now. We do need startup costs at times to get groups in. Those can be a little bit higher than the kind of constant maintenance costs of having groups in the study. So I just want to mention that Santa Energy and the Stephen J. and Madeline M. Santa Environmental Fund really pitched in to help buy equipment and supplies specifically. And some of the group specific expenses like, boat fuel time and boat operator time that went into bringing the Bridgeport Harbor into the study this year. And then EPA will be covering it as part of the kind of overall program fees 2023 and on. And also 2022, the Long Island Sound Report Card, please stay tuned. We're going to be releasing that this fall, and it'll have updated Black Rock Harbor grades. I'll mention with Bridgeport Harbor, my last point here too, is that we're already in touch with Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. There was some monitoring already happening in Bridgeport Harbor, which these Unified Water Study stations, which have a little bit more of an extension into the northwest portion, will really complement and help the state make a full Clean Water Act assessment of Bridgeport Harbor. So besides those data going into the report card and talks like this, they're also going to go into, Clean Water Act assessments that Connecticut makes every couple of years. All right. And with that, I am done. And hopefully I
All
saved a little
right,
bit of
thank
time for
you,
questions.
Peter. So, if anyone has questions for Dan or Peter, there was a few in the chat. Well, does anyone have any questions right now? Okay,
I'm looking at the chat.
I see the ARPA question was answered. How long can the money be used? Kat asked what accounts for the CSO reductions between 2030 and 24? Dan, is that further separation? What's the plan for having that slope on
This is-
reductions?
Joe La Liberty with CDM Smith. I can handle Cat's other one too, the public notification. So there's two plans for the Bridgeport WPCA. One is the combined sewer overflow CSO long-term control plan. And that was originally drafted in the early, I don't know, somewhere around 2010 and approved by DEEP in 2018. But then there's also the wastewater facilities plan that CDM Smith did starting in 2019. And what we did as part of the facilities plan is we looked at what Dan presented, is we looked at taking additional flow into the plant, which would help address the combined sewer overflow long-term control plan. That facilities plan went through a pretty rigorous public outreach program. There was a scoping meeting by DEP. I think we've presented to this group before. It also went through an environmental impact assessment, EIE process. And it ultimately was approved by DEP. Subsequently, we just submitted a long-term control plan update for the CSO program, and we submitted that to DEP in December. That plan basically outlines what was in the facilities plan, but we had to officially alter the long-term control plan. So that is the public process. As for the CSO reductions beyond 2030, the CSO long-term control plan basically laid out projects between now and 2030, which culminates with the east side and the west side plant, and then the Ellsworth CSOs, as well as the Ash Creek CSOs. But it has not determined exactly what would be done with the remaining CSOs that are required to be controlled to a one-year storm by 2039. So a significant metering program would need to be done after these major upgrades are performed to determine how is the best and most cost-effective way to deal with the remaining CSOs by the 2039 deadline.
So you're basically just connecting the slope. You're going to get to the same spot.
Correct.
Not quite exactly sure how it's going to get there.
Correct, because of the
fill-
major change, right? Because of the major
Right.
change by taking in more flow to the plant, which reduces the CSOs by over 50%.
And just a note on that, there's a joint project by MetroCog, Groundwork Bridgeport, the Nature Conservancy, and Save the Sound to site 60 bioswales in the west end area, the west side sewer shed, and that's just the beginning. So New Haven's put in hundreds of these things, and Philadelphia's put in thousands of them. And there's a professor, Gabe Benoit at Yale, who's been looking at the volume that is shunted away from. He's looking at surface waters right now. And though it doesn't stop flooding, obviously it takes the peak off from the stream gauges. So the intensity of the floods, they remove a lot of water when they're used in aggregate. So yeah, I think that's going to potentially be part of the solution. And I know Lauren gave a great support letter for that grant and has done some of her own bioswale stuff as she's just doing other work around Bridgeport. So every little bit helps. Do we have any others?
For flooding issues, the Oxbrook environmental impact evaluation is up on the website now. So anyone that lives in that area or downstream in Ash Creek, and they're also shunting some of it over to, and now I'm going to forget the other brook, Island Brook. So you guys may want to take a look at that too and comment on it.
That's great.
I actually should go soon. I'm gonna be late to my 7, but that's okay. I saw Dan at one point. I think it was Dan. You were talking about the shellfish impacts of moving the outfall, the wastewater treatment plant outfall outside of the inner portion of the harbor. And I'm thinking Stanford, Norwalk, some of the other embayments that have outfalls deep within their harbors, and some of the issues that they also face with hypoxia in the inner portion of those harbors. I mean, are there examples where an outfall has been moved to a certain point where it's not going to impact the shellfish, but at the same time, it's not loading nitrogen into a very susceptible portion of an embayment, just with flushing in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question if you got the effluent out of the inner harbor there, there'd be a benefit. But there's also limited funds for the project, so we focused on cleaning up the water quality that's coming out of the existing plant, and that's going to have a huge impact. Putting out cleaner water and capturing the untreated CSO waters as well. So it's sort of like it's almost like two projects. The outfall project and the plant upgrade.
Right.
What, you didn't want to just take the dirty water and put it farther out first?
No, he needs to do both. I wasn't suggesting that.
Actually, that
But-
would have
but
been more
getting it out
cost
of that
effective,
inner
Bill. We
portion.
probably should
know.
have considered that alternative.
Just move the problem.
Yeah. It just seems it's such a susceptible portion of the harbor, and the way it pinches there. And I haven't looked at the flushing data in a long time for Black Rock Harbor, but I think you said a TN reduction of 60%, 64% or something along those lines. And I hope that meets and kind of limits, or really needs to get rid of the anoxia that's present in that inner portion, and hypoxia as well. So I get what you're saying. I'm not a big fan of dilution as the answer to pollution, right? But at the same time, it's that outfall so deep in the harbor. It definitely should stay on people's radars.
There are two examples in our area of them being moved. Mumford Cove was one of them. And after 15 years, all the organic carbon, all the muck that was built up, it had been digested, and it got down to eelgrass safe levels of nitrogen from moving that pipe out. And then another recent one, the Great South Bay on the south shore of Long Island, they moved the big nitrogen source out of there. They created a clam sanctuary, seeded it, and the commercial harvest went up, I think, 1,100 or 1,200% to the commercial fleet, because the whole system became balanced again. So that's definitely a long-term goal for all the parts of Long Island Sound. It just, we have to prioritize how we use what resources we have. We pushed really hard last year in the biannual budget, and we're successful in getting an additional $50 million a year in GO bonding. So, or 50 million total, I believe it was, right? And that we pushed through the co-chair of the bonding subcommittee surreptitiously, by the way, but it happened. And now DEEP has some more resources. That GO bonds are what are grants. So the way the Clean Water Fund works, you can get, say you're doing a CSO project, which I would argue on Lauren's behalf that improving the plant is definitely a CSO project, but I know you got to fight that out with DEEP. So if it's a CSO project and cost 100 million, you can get 50 million in GO bonds, which are grants, and then 50 million in a low interest loan. That's the revolving loan portion of this, the state revolving loan fund, part of the Clean Water Act. The feds don't give very much money compared to the state. Connecticut's one of the most progressive clean water funds in the country. They put tremendous amount in there. And that's why they've gone from, I believe it was 18 CSO towns down to 6. So they're really focused on spending billions of dollars to get everything cleaned up. So this is a really good example. I mean, Bridgeport's had problems for years. And I think under the management of Lauren, we've actually started making some really rapid progress. And Peter's got great monitoring in place. And I know there are plans to get the aquaculture school even more involved with the mechanics of the running the sewage treatment plant, plus the water quality testing. So I think, hopefully we're back here in 10 years and we're swimming off the docks in Captain Cove, not worried about the water quality, and everything's good.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, with these data that I need to jump, but the data are going to show a really good baseline, and then you put these improvements in place. And with other data that's being collected, of course, too, we'll be able to kind of help track those improvements as we move forward. So really a pleasure to be here today. Thanks, everyone. I need to go. We'll see you later.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I think we'll probably wrap it up. If there last call for questions. And with that, I think we will close.